Hi, everyone. I'm Ed Robertson, host of TV Confidential. Thank you so much for listening to our program on PWRN, Passionate World Radio Network. If you like TV Confidential or any of the other programs you hear every week on PWRN, please consider supporting this station by becoming a patron of Passionate World Radio Network through Patreon. It is easy to do. It won't cost you more than a few dollars per month. And best of all, you will help PWRN continue to educate, enlighten, and entertain our global audience of 10 million strong and growing. For more information, go to patreon.com/PWRN. That's Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/PWRN. And thank you again for listening.
Welcome to Passionate W World, R Radio N Network, LLC, a multimedia company. Ann Arbor, Michigan, Boston, Massachusetts, Liverpool, England, Melrose, Florida, Los Angeles, California, Fullerton, California, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Illinois are one of the many broadcast homes of PWRN, a multimedia company. The world in your hands. And now, without further ado, let me present to you one of our many hosts and their programs.
Ed Robertson welcoming you to TV Confidential, radio talk show about television. Then we'll welcome back our friend Ralph Senesky in our second hour. Ralph Senesky, longtime member of the Directors Guild of America and a man whose work as a television director includes multiple episodes of some of the most popular drama and comedy series of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, including the original Star Trek and the original Twilight Zone. Ralph Senesky will join us in our second hour. We hope you'll stay tuned for that. And speaking of the original Twilight Zone, coming up later on in this hour, we will play part 2 of our conversation with Mark Dawidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. We hope you'll stay tuned for that as well. In the meantime, Tony Figueroa and Donna Allen are with us as they bring us This Week in TV History. Tony's segment, as always, is brought to us by our friends at Story Salon, Southern California's longest-running, regularly performing live storytelling ensemble. Live shows every Wednesday night at the Art Parlor in Valley Village. For more information, go to StorySalon.com, Facebook.com/Story Salon. Ordinarily, Tony and Donna take a look at notable figures or notable moments from TV's past. This week, we're going to do something just a little bit different. In the last couple of weeks, I'm sure you've heard about it. There are 2 commercials, one by Pepsi, one by Carl's Jr.
Hardee's, yeah.
Hardee's, which owns Carl's Jr.,
yeah,
which made the news for completely different reasons.
Should we start with the reimagining of Carl's Jr. and Hardee's?
Yes.
Because, years ago, you grew up in California, so did I. Carl's Jr. has been around, on this coast. And you had different ad campaigns. They animated the logo, which is that star, which is on the top of the sign. And then for a while, the founder of Carl's Jr., Carl Karcher, was doing the commercials himself. Then Carl Karcher was animated with being interviewed by the star. And then he passed away. And they were doing different types of ad campaigns to sell both Carl's Jr. here and Hardee's in the Midwest.
Right.
And I always thought it was more of a satirical look. But they would, let's say, sexualize the ad campaign.
They crossed the line.
They crossed the line and they decided to be the man show. If you remember that, the Jimmy Kimmel, Adam Carolla show that aired on the Comedy Central about 20 years ago.
Yeah, they did one with Paris Hilton. There was one I seem to remember on Mechanical Bull.
Yep.
Remember, their slogan for a while was, if it doesn't get all over the place, it doesn't belong in your face. They did talk about, because they did have some tamer ones where it was just, when you're biting into one of their hamburgers, you're going to make a mess. And I think that just continued. They just kind of went on that.
Their Super Bowl commercial, was it last year, was rather tame with the which model was it walking through the farmer's market?
Yeah, and you're assuming she's naked by the way things were shot. I think it had more of that Austin Powers type look to it, where it was very suggestive but humorous at the same time.
And as far as those ads go, it was rather tame.
Yeah, and I mean, they kind of took the same approach, speaking of the Super Bowl, that GoDaddy did, for many, many years.
Yeah, GoDaddy, I think, was also going right off of the Janet Jackson controversy, and they went full on with it.
And it's not so much about the product, it's getting people talking about the company and the brand. And what the thinking is, okay, if they talk about us Monday morning, or if we get a lot of hits and a lot of sharing of the video within 48 hours, 72 hours of when we release it, that will have people talking about us, Hardee's or Carl's Jr., and that in turn will get people to go to the restaurant.
Oh, well, they weren't. They were only selling to a certain demographic. I mean...
No, I'm just saying that's the mentality behind the idea.
Yeah. By the way, the ad you were talking about, the Super Bowl, was their all-natural campaign.
Yeah.
That's why the setting was in a farmer's market. And the illusion that the girl was all natural.
Yes.
Yeah, but that started with the Paris Hilton campaign. But I think the current ad that they're doing right now, where they've completely reimagined the brand.
It starts off like a commercial of the last 5 years, and then an actor playing Hardy Sr.
Yeah, so it's Carl Hardy.
Yeah.
So,
and Junior. Yeah.
Your dad is on his way. Your dad is on his way in. The adults coming back and taking over.
But totally and visually acknowledging what they've been doing the last couple of years.
Which I'm glad they did. I mean, some people would argue, well, you're still seeing the girls. That briefly, they're acknowledging it. They're not saying it never happened.
Yeah.
However, I don't think we'll see them again.
Yeah.
My comment, the first time I saw it, I laughed out loud. I mean, the full version is genius. Mm-hmm. Is this a metaphor for the country right now?
I think the grown-ups are coming. Yeah, I thought they did a
one hopes.
One hopes, yeah, definitely. But the idea, that the grown-ups are coming in, and okay, you had your fun, and but referencing Junior was just sowing his wild oats, and we're going to get back to what we're about, which is the burger. And I think the performance is being done.
The casting is amazing.
Yeah.
And there were still little hits of, we're still going to have fun. Dad is on the way out of the office and says, keep the bowl, as in the mechanical bowl.
Right. Yeah, little subtle
little things like that.
By the way, that's Charles Easton, who is playing
Junior?
Senior. Who was on Whose Line Is It Anyway, and he's on Nashville. So a very funny guy. Also a great musical talent. He did a lot of the musical bits with Wayne Brady on Whose Line Is It Anyway. So he's done a lot of that stuff. He's a lot younger than what he's portraying, but so you can see him in the flashbacks when they're giving the history. But to kind of reimagine the whole history of Carl's Jr. and Hardee's by coming up with this character, I think is also rather inspired to kind of reinvent themselves this way.
Who's the actor who plays Junior, who I think is also brilliant and very funny?
Yeah, he is perfect. His name is Drew Tarver, Tarver, and he's from the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater.
That makes sense.
So that explains. Yeah,
he's perfect.
And he's also starring in the show $1 Billion Properties, and is a regular guest on Comedy Bang Bang. So so you have two people who have a strong improv background. Yeah. But the whole campaign, and just going from the office in that environment with the mechanical bull and
the hot tub,
and all of that is very funny. And then to have the long walk going out to the parking lot, and Junior's car is being removed.
and it's a commercial the way I think commercials should be.
Yeah.
Give us your message, and entertain us,
Yeah.
please.
But I think they needed to purge the imagery of the previous campaign.
Yes, and they did it by delivering that message and entertaining us.
This is what
Thank
we're
you.
about. Now, it made me think of the Jack in the Box campaign from several years ago. And we look back, and again, you grew up in San Francisco. I grew up out here. You used to have a Jack in the Box where the sign looked like a Jack in the Box.
Yes.
Right? You had the clown head on a spring coming out of a box, and it said Jack in the Box. You drove around the back, and you talked into a
Yes.
clown.
Yes.
Right? Which has been mocked and redone.
I'm from Ohio. We did not have those, but I knew who it was.
Yeah.
Through-
So it was a
There's even an episode of Rockford Files where Jim orders some onion rings at like 1 o'clock in the morning, and he's talking to the clown.
yeah.
It was filmed in an actual Jack in the Box,
So it
which is
was-
unusual for network television at that time.
Yeah, because that was not really product placement. It
No.
just was, but it was. Those were very
It
popular.
was Rockford getting a snack because he liked junk food.
Yeah, and Jack in the Box and McDonald's at the same time were jumping in on the breakfast bandwagon.
Yeah.
You remember when these places did not have breakfast? And so they did that. But at a certain point, somebody within the Jack in the Box organization thought, okay, this is old. And they did a commercial where they're blowing up the clown. And it's the clown at the drive-thru. And I don't remember if that was Nidra Bowles or it was one of these older actors, that just played the old lady the
Yeah.
whole time, the sweet old lady. And there were several that were doing that. And it was like, no, you can't do that. And they said, no, look at what we're coming. We're changing everything, and look at how much better it's going to be. And then she tells the guy to, hit the plunger, and say, blow that clown or something like that. Maybe not that phrase, but she instructed the demolition team to destroy the clown. And there was this, there's a whole new look at Jack in the Box. And, it's like, Jack in the Box.
I remember that.
Now you're cooking, Jack. And so they had like this whole new look, and the clown was gone. It was still Jack in the Box. And then for a while the campaign was, watch out, McDonald's, we're changing. And they had this whole look, and then they had a new jingle. It was like, dun, 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 dun.
Yeah.
And that was like the whole 80s. And it wasn't helping them. It was not helping them.
Instead of the clown, you would have the white on red insignia Jack in the Box with
And kind of a 3D,
that
look
was,
of
that
a
was
box.
their logo for a while, right?
Yeah, but when we were kids, it was a full box.
Yeah.
I mean, it was not the image of a box. It was a box. And so they realized at some point they screwed up. And they acknowledged it. They introduced the Jack that we now see, coming back to the boardroom. And he said, oh, yeah, I'm back. You remember I went away for a while, and they showed the explosion. And then I said, and he goes, and then there were some changes. And then you look into, like, the offices, and you hear, dun, 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 dun. And he says, but I'm back after some minor plastic surgery, and I'm ready to take over. And he's standing in front of the boardroom, and he pulls out a remote control. He hits a switch, and the boardroom blows up. So, and then it's like, the campaign was Jack's back.
Yes.
And I think, it was a brilliant campaign and a brilliant way to acknowledge they screwed up. And I think, in the case of Jack in the Box, it was also they changed too much too quickly. They basically destroyed everything that people liked about it. So I think it was not just the commercial campaign, but the overall look of the restaurants and all of that on a bigger scale. Yeah, and here Carl's Jr. and Hardee's are trying to get back to the basics and reinvent themselves. We see this in commercials, or, remember in the days of bloopers and practical jokes, you would see more regional products, things like Stan Freberg, for example. He would do stuff like this. And there was a beer in upstate New York that decided to change their formula and were suffering big time. And it was the ad campaign that Stan Freberg came in, where they had created, the founder of the company who was telling the customers that he retired, put relatives in charge of the beer. They made a few mistakes, but I'm back here to correct that problem. And they had a whole series of ads explaining that the old formula is coming back, don't worry. And the Stan Freberg trial, and in the last installment of that campaign, he's being asked in an interview, so what became of these relatives who made this big mistake? He said, well, we put them in charge of the labeling department. And then he holds up a bottle of the beer, and the label's upside down. And then they went and had the manufacturer print a whole series of beer bottles with the label upside down, to kind of play with it. And it was brilliant, and it did help that small-time beer company.
Well, I guess time will tell if Carl's Jr. Hardee's
if this will work. But
come back.
Look at what KFC or Kentucky Fried Chicken did. They resurrected Colonel Sanders. Mm-hmm. Again, you're taking a real person who there really was a guy named Colonel Sanders. And I think anybody of a certain age might not realize that he's not like Tony the Tiger or something. No. He was a Colonel Harlan Sanders. They did try to revive him.
They tried a couple of different actors playing him.
Yeah, and having some fun with it.
Having some fun, which maybe I'm not in the demo that they're targeting, but being of a certain age and remember the actual Colonel and actually liking the Colonel when he appeared in his own.
Yeah,
I did not like the making fun. Okay, Daryl Hammond was the second.
Yeah,
forget
George Hamilton did one.
Norm Macdonald was either the first. He either preceded or succeeded Daryl Hammond. I thought Norm Macdonald was okay.
Yeah,
I didn't care for the Daryl Hammond because I think it was too. He was making fun of him. I didn't like that.
Yeah.
And I forget who's playing him now.
Yeah, the last one he's Gold.
Yeah,
and they're trying to catch it. Yeah, I don't. I remember his voice. He also Colonel Sanders was in the Jerry Lewis movie The Big Mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And his voice was very distinct, and you could tell what region he's from.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that franchise also, remember, it was Kentucky Fried Chicken, now it's KFC. I think they wanted to disassociate with Kentucky.
No, Fried.
Fried.
Right.
Oh, okay, so I thought, okay, so they didn't want to be fried. They're still fried.
Yes, I know, but they're KFC.
But they're KFC.
Sounds healthier.
Yes.
Yes. So they wanted to, just change that around, but we're not the target demographic.
We're not the target demographic. childoftelevision.blogspot.com, childoftelevision.blogspot.com, also storysalon.com or facebook.com/storysalon. Donna's new book, by the way, is called Fall Again, Beginnings. It's a romantic novel that asks the question, what would you do if you met the perfect person, only it was not the perfect time? For more information, go to fallagainseries.com. Tony and Donna will be with us when we come back and play part 2 of our conversation with Mark Dawidziak, author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. Among other things, we'll talk about some of the many examples of humor in the Twilight Zone, while also taking another look at the TV career of Don Rickles. We'll do all that after this quick time out here on TV Confidential.
Hi, this is Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passionate World Radio Network. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. I want to tell you that since I started attending the courses put out by T.R. Garland for leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals, that PWR Network has accomplished several of its goals. 1, JV partnership. 2, JV advocates. 3, a potential writing position. 4, an invitation to collaborate with a major internet radio network. 5, 400% increase on the profiles that have connected with me and who have come to review PWRN's profile. 2 potential clients, both CEOs. And I finally recognized and found my ideal audience. I cannot thank T.R. Garland enough for his course, 12 weeks of leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals. And you, too, can achieve this kind of stellar accomplishment. So don't hesitate. contact T.R. Garland today. Connect with him on LinkedIn and ask him about his course, Leveraging LinkedIn for Speakers, Authors, Coaches, and Service-Based Professionals. You won't regret it. In fact, you'll probably thank him.
How do you do? You gentlemen, of course, know how to push a product. That essentially is your job. My presence here is for much the same purpose, simply to push a product. To acquaint you with an entertainment product which we hope and which we rather expect will make your product pushing that much easier. What you're about to see, gentlemen, is a series called The Twilight Zone. We think it's a rather special kind of series. Essentially, people watch television to get entertained. And the keynote of this series, the thing we're concerned with, the thing we're aiming for, the thing we're working toward is entertainment. This is a series for the storyteller, because it's our thinking that an audience will always sit still and listen and watch a well-told story. And now that I've immodestly gone on record predicting the high quality of this series, let me very briefly show you what we mean by a special kind of series. You know, writers in general are notoriously bad verbal tellers of stories. We do much, much better behind a typewriter. So I hope you'll bear with me while I tell you about a few stories that happen to be the first ones we're shooting in our current production cycle.
Hi, this is Gary Lockwood. You're listening to TV Confidential.
Ed Robertson, along with Tony Figueroa, Donna Allen, and our guest Mark DeWidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the author of several books on film and television, including The Columbo File, The Night Stalker Companion, and Jim Tully, American writer, Irish Rover, and Hollywood Brawler. Mark's latest book is Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, a new book that takes all of the various life lessons, ground rules, inspirational thoughts, and musings of the Twilight Zone, and basically says we would all be much better people if we lived our life according to what the Twilight Zone teaches us. Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone is available in bookstores everywhere through Thomas Dunn Books. You can also find it both as a hardcover edition and as an ebook through Amazon.com and wherever books are sold online. You might recall that we ended part one of our conversation with Mark on last week's program with a discussion of Richard Matheson, the Twilight Zone writer who also wrote the classic made-for-TV movie The Night Stalker and its sequel, The Night Strangler. As Mark pointed out, in many respects, The Night Stalker is a direct descendant of the Twilight Zone, while, as we just mentioned in our open, Mark's other books on film and television include The Night Stalker Companion. As we pick up the conversation, we said to Mark that one commonality between The Night Stalker Companion and his latest book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, is that there's a lot of you in both of those books, but for completely different reasons.
I would agree with that. I would certainly agree that there are two of the books where I allowed my personality to come into it and my own stories to come into it, much more in the Twilight Zone than the Kolchak book. But the Kolchak book is a much more personal book than, say, the Columbo book. There is a distance on the Columbo book. I don't allow myself to enter the narrative at any point in the Columbo book, but I do and I'm all over the place in the Twilight Zone book. Yeah, you know, you can't, you get sick of me because you're bumping into me left and right in this.
So, if we could go back just to humor in the Twilight Zone, looking up Mr. Dingle the Strong.
Yes, because of Mr. Rickles, is that?
Yeah. As we're recording this, folks, it's within a few hours of the news of Don Rickles' death.
Yeah, they are checking out with alarming rapidity, and it's alarming just how many people who contributed to this book, like James Best and George Clayton Johnson and Fritz Weaver, who didn't live to see it. So it's a generation that's passing, and it's our childhoods. It's our this is very deep emotional stuff. Rickles was part of all of our upbringing. On the Carson Show and on all of those. Celebrity roasts, and everything that he did, and it's just it's one that it feels personal.
You know, if you look at his Wikipedia page, just his television appearances alone, going back to the 50s, it is amazing how long that list goes. And
he shows up on so many shows I watch. He's on the Dick Van Dyke Show. He's in 2 episodes of the Dick Van Dyke Show. He's in episodes of Get Smart. He's in episodes of F Troop. He's in episodes of The Twilight Zone. You're right. You're exactly. You don't think of Don Rickles as an actor. And you don't think of him as anything but the insult comic, but he appeared in a tremendous number of things.
And carrying that a little further, you don't think of him as a dramatic actor. And I never had a chance to talk to him, but I know people who did. And I have been told if you really wanted him to open up, ask about his work on, like, the Bob Hope Theater, a lot of where he actually got a chance to be another character other than Mr. Warmth, other than a comic character.
He was very close friends with Jack Klugman.
Yeah.
A lot of people know that he was very close friends with Bob Newhart and Don Adams, and they know he's made a lot. But a friendship which was not as well known was the fact that he and Jack Klugman were very, very good friends. And Klugman always told him he could be a very fine dramatic actor. Klugman always said, the world knows you as this insult comic, but underneath that is this really, really fine actor. And Rickles did a special. I think it was for NBC. I'm not sure, but he did a special, and Klugman was a guest star on the special. And like halfway through the special, Rickles said, we're going to do something. I didn't want to do it, but Jack Klugman forced me to do this. And they did a scene from Inherit the Wind.
Whoa.
With Rickles playing the William Jennings Bryan character and Klugman playing the Clarence Darrow character. And they did a scene from the cross-examination moment. And Klugman wanted the world to see that this guy knows how to act. This guy can be a very, very fine actor. And I'll never forget that, because Rickles said, in many times in interviews, he said, I would have never had the stones to do that if Jack Klugman hadn't forced me to do it.
He did an episode of Run for Your Life called Down with Willie Hatch.
Yeah.
Where he played a nightclub comic, but basically, and this circles back to the Twilight Zone and your bookmark, the lesson in that particular episode, Down with Willie Hatch, was basically it's a variation of the road to hell is paved with good intentions, where Rickles' character is kind of a down on his luck comic, and Ben Gazzara, because that was his function in the show, he kind of gets him to make a comeback, and in doing so, an element of his past becomes public and ends up making things worse for him. It was one of those things where had Gazzara's character known about that, he may have thought twice about it, but he thought he was doing him a favor, and that's something we see a lot in the Twilight Zone, too.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned it. I was a big fan of Run for Your Life, and I'm sorry more people don't know about that. It's one of those shows that you say that you get blank stares when you turn when you mention it to most people, and it's just like 1960s TV gets a bad rap because they say, well, it's all stupid gimmicks. It's all I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched and all this, kind of. And I said, there was some really interesting stuff tried in the 1960s. If nothing else, the Dick Van Dyke Show and the Twilight Zone belong in the 1960s for the most part. And those are going to be two of the most towering shows of all time. But there was some really interesting stuff tried. Yeah, there was a lot of stupid stuff. There was a lot of My Mother the Car and, Mr. Terrific and stuff like that. But, there were also some really interesting stuff done around the edges. And Run for Your Life was one of those that was done. And, again, it shows that people don't know. That there's this kind of loss.
For the uninitiated, Run for Your Life was basically the only knockoff of the Fugitive that worked.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's because Roy Huggins did it.
Right. But it was the same idea that you'd had an ongoing story.
Yeah.
Like Then King Bronson was another one that did this, which will get even more blank stares. But the idea that you had a weekly story with only the central character was recurring.
Yeah, an anthology show with a regular character. Yeah.
Right.
And we're talking to Mark Duwidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the author of Everything I Need to Know, I Learned in the Twilight Zone, a heartfelt tribute to Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone that also doubles as a self-help book. Everything I Need to Know, I Learned in The Twilight Zone is available in bookstores everywhere through Thomas Dunn Books. You can also find it both in hardback edition and as an ebook through Amazon.com and wherever books are sold online. Tony?
And to be fair, when we're talking especially the early 1960s, at the time that The Twilight Zone premiered and the Andy Griffith Show and the Dick Van Dyke Show, we were on the heels of a blacklist. And I think there were a lot of people, a lot of writers, a lot of people that were in the not only on the creative end, but also on the money end that wanted to play things safe. And that's what allowed a Rod Serling and later a Gene Roddenberry to come through, because they came up with ways of telling the story without telling the story or setting it into space or however they were able to do it. So you did have a lot of stupid stuff that came out because people wanted to play it safe. And you know, when people judge it now by modern morality, let's call it, you know, so, oh, it was clean. Yeah, because they were scared to death to do anything provocative or anything that was relevant to the time period. You didn't see a lot of political satire on primetime TV. You never would have had a West Wing or something like that at that time, because many of these writers were basically, some of them never worked again, or they worked under a different name, and there were actors also who went through that. So I think there was that sense of fear that was going through at that time, where there were certain things that you just did not touch on. You know, it wasn't
absolutely, and
yeah.
In fact, The Twilight Zone does touch on it because, you know,
in a roundabout way, yeah.
Probably the episode that has grown most in resonance over the years is The Monsters Are Due in Maple Street. And
excellent, yeah.
There's no question that Rod was writing about the McCarthy era with The Monsters Are Due in Maple Street. The idea of neighbor turning against neighbor, not trusting the person you've lived next door to for 5 years, your friends, the fact that these divisions and fear and paranoia can drive you apart and turn you into monsters. He's very much writing about the McCarthy era and the Red Scare. But as we've become a more divided nation, that episode has grown in resonance to the point where it now it depicts an America in which the conditions are different, but the message is just as relevant, if not more so. I don't know that anybody who has read the book or has asked me about the book hasn't referenced that chapter and that episode, which I think is interesting because we are living in a very, very divided time. And it goes back to what I was saying about how Rod's writing is timeless. Yeah. Is that it can be applied and probably always will be applied, in some cases sadly, because it means we haven't learned the lessons and we haven't changed. Yeah. But the Monsters Are Due in Maple Street is it's an amazing study of human nature. And, I do quote the historian Arthur Schlesinger in that chapter, as the motto of the country is E pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. And the original meaning of that was that out of the 13 colonies became 13 states, out of many came one nation. But in the 1800s, when we became an immigrant nation, and the Statue of Liberty welcomed wave after wave of immigrants yearning to breathe free, the idea of E pluribus unum became out of many cultures, out of many ethnicities, out of many belief systems, out of many religions. We become stronger through inclusion. We become stronger a nation as out of many, one. And as we became an increasingly divided nation, Arthur Schlesinger noted that what we needed was a whole lot less pluribus and a whole lot more unum.
Yeah. Well,
and that message rings through that episode greatly, that what joins us together, and then it's not just for a neighborhood, it's not just for a country, it's for the entire planet, is that we share much more than separate us. And if we don't understand that, we are going to eat each other up alive, as Claude Aiken says in the episode. Yeah. The only thing that's going to happen here is we're going to end up eating each other up alive. And if we do not get to that idea that we share more things, we harp on what separates us by ethnicity, by gender, by religion, by income, we separate ourselves. And it's us against them. And it's always us against them. And if we do not get to the point where we understand, hey, we've got a lot more in common and a lot more at stake than we have to what separates us, we ain't going to make it. It's just that simple.
Keith Olbermann used to quote Monsters on Maple Street a lot when he was still on MSNBC, and And now, I think for the last 6 months or so, bi-weekly or so, she will put one of her dad's quotes to kind of make a commentary of whatever's happening in the news that day. And it is amazing how relevant some of her dad's quotes are in what's happening right now. It is just totally amazing how perfect she could probably, whatever's happening in the news, I bet she could find one of her dad's quotes that just kind of summarizes it.
Well, Rod is one of those guys who, he remember, he found himself as a writer through recovering after the war. That Rod was a paratrooper in the South Pacific, which is one of the, most dangerous assignments you could have had in one of the most dangerous places you could do it. And he comes out of the war psychologically scarred and physically scarred. And so he goes to Yellow Springs, Ohio, to Antioch College, and he doesn't know that he wants to be a writer. He doesn't enter Antioch knowing he wants to write. He discovers writing at Antioch. And Eugene O'Neill once said that, basically that writers don't really need psychiatrists, that writers use writing as a way to exercise their own demons, that he had a phrase for it. O'Neill called it writing himself sane. And I think that's what Rod did. Rod discovered writing, and he put all of this, and when he discovered, he also discovered this view of history, that, there's Rod, having gone through World War II, one of the most cataclysmic events of all time. World War II ends. I mean, he grows up during the Depression. He goes through World War II, which concludes with the detonating of two, what we call devices, on Japan. So he sees the atomic age come in. And I think in the detonation of the atomic bomb, there was so much light there, he saw with amazing clarity the whole parade of human culture and human development. As to the point that he wants to be a writer, just at the point that he's discovered he wants to be a writer, and he's got a lot to say because of how clear his vision is at this point. And I think the great shame is that Rod Serling only spent 50 years on this planet. Yeah. I truly believe, I know Ann believes this, but I truly believe there was another act. I truly believe that somebody that smart, that talented, that much of a compulsive writer was not going to amaze us one more time. So I think, what stories would he have told? It's amazing he had as many acts as he did, because he basically has 3 acts. He has that first act in live TV, he has The Twilight Zone, and then he has this third act, which includes some pretty amazing TV movies, some amazing movies like Planet of the Apes and 7 Days in May, and then he has the Night Gallery, and although Night Gallery wasn't what he wanted it to be, he certainly did some incredible work on Night Gallery.
He certainly did. In fact, you discussed this in a couple of places in Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. They're tearing down Tim Riley's bar, which is one of the most autobiographical pieces Serling ever wrote, and many will say it's one of the best things he ever wrote.
It's also part of a continuum, is that if you go back to his first triumph, which is Patterns, it is about a young businessman who befriends an aging businessman who can't keep up, and Richard Kiley playing Andy, and Ed Begley playing, and at the end he's writing, they're tearing down Tim Riley's bar, which is about an aging, that's basically the Richard Kiley character having aged and still trying to keep up with the people who are the young lions there. And in between he writes Walking Distance and Stop at Willoughby for the Twilight Zone. Those 4 pieces are all about businessmen dealing at different ages, and in some ways they are the continuation of the same story. And I think that's and that's one of the things that you discover about Rod Serling when you step back and look at his whole career as a writer. His themes don't change. He writes about how he writes about them, his view of them changes because he ages. But the things he cared about don't change. One thing that he was always runs throughout his entire, it's in there tearing down Tim Riley's bar, but it's in a lot of his Twilight Zones and it's in a lot of his early work as well, is this amazing empathy and caring for the elder. This idea of what do you do with people who are at the end? What do you do with the people who have given their entire life and they are now used up and they've lost a step? And this has become, Rod was always interested in that, of the plight of the elderly and how we treat the elderly. And this is true of him at the very beginning of his career when he's a very, very young man. This is true. There's something in him that resonates to that. So Rod's themes don't change. You look at his themes and what he's examining, the worth of the individual, the person caught in the moral conflict. These are all themes which Rod returns to again and again and again. And sometimes he's working it out on a grand scale of how it's, this is the whole society, and sometimes, more to the point, he's doing it on the individual.
We're talking to Mark Dawidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, a heartfelt tribute to Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone that also doubles as a self-help book. Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone is available in bookstores everywhere through Thomas Dunn Books. You can also find it both in hardback edition and as an ebook through Amazon.com and wherever books are sold online. This circles back to dramas of the 60s that people don't know about, but people should know about. And this also definitely circles back to Serling's work post Twilight Zone. I recently discovered a show of his called The Loner.
I knew you were going to say The Loner. Lloyd Bridges.
Yeah.
His Western.
Yeah.
His thoughtful, cerebral Western, which the network hated.
Yes.
Because they didn't want thoughtful and cerebral. They wanted violence.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of pressure on him to deliver violence, and he wouldn't bend, and The Loner did not last.
And that's a shame, because I think they filmed 25 of them. I think he wrote all but a couple.
Yeah.
And Lloyd Bridges, you can see Lloyd Bridges really appreciated the opportunity to do Serling, the way in the way that Jack Klugman talks about in the quote that you share in your book.
Mm-hmm.
Just the fact to act out the words of Rod Serling, and even in the moments where there is gunplay, because it is supposed to be a Western, they're not even secondary; they're tertiary. We're talking to Mark Dawidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. We'll take a quick time out, then we'll continue our conversation with Mark here on TV Confidential.
Hi, this is Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passionate World Radio Network. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. I want to tell you that since I started attending the courses put out by T.R. Garland for leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals, that PWR Network has accomplished several of its goals. 1, JV partnership. 2, JV advocates. 3, a potential writing position. 4, an invitation to collaborate with a major internet radio network. 5, 400% increase on the profiles that have connected with me and who have come to review PWRN's profile. 2 potential clients, both CEOs. And I finally recognized and found my ideal audience. I cannot thank T.R. Garland enough for his course, 12 weeks of leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals. And you too can achieve this kind of stellar accomplishment. So don't hesitate. Contact T.R. Garland today. Connect with him on LinkedIn and ask him about his course, Leveraging LinkedIn for Speakers, Authors, Coaches, and Service-Based Professionals. You won't regret it. In fact, you'll probably thank him.
Hello, this is Eric Braden. You're listening to TV Confidential.
In the aftermath of the bloodletting called the Civil War, thousands of ruthless, restless, searching men traveled west. Such a man is William Colton. Like the others, he carried a blanket roll, a proficient gun, and a dedication to a new chapter in American history, the opening of the West.
Ed Robertson, along with Tony Figueroa, Donna Allen, and our guest Mark Dawidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, a new book that basically says we would all be much better people if we took to heart all of the principles at work in the Twilight Zone. Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone is available in bookstores everywhere through Thomas Dunn Books. You can also find it both as a hardcover edition and as an ebook at Amazon.com and wherever books are sold online. Before we went to break, we were talking about some of Rod Serling's other contributions to film and television during the 1960s, including the short-lived series The Loner, starring Lloyd Bridges.
There's just so much amazing work on either side of Rod's. Again, I concentrated on the Twilight Zone. There's a fellow who I've become friends with named Nick Parisi, who is working on a book on Rod's entire writing career, from the earliest radio scripts and stuff, and he wants to chart the whole writing career. And and that's something which I kind of I'm very much in favor of that and supporting that, because as much as I love, and I just wrote an entire book about the Twilight Zone, so obviously that's always going to be a tentpole in Rod's career, but it's not everything he wrote. I mean, it's something I tried to stress in the prologue to the book about Rod, which is that this is a body of work. This is an entire body of work that you have to look at and consider, and even some of the major titles. The Loner is actually pretty prominent on his compared to some of the titles that are on his resume. But like he did a drama not long before the Twilight Zone, called The Velvet Alley. And The Velvet Alley, now first off, get this, stars Art Carney and Jack Klugman. Which means, I once pointed this out to Klugman, and he was stunned. He had actually worked with all three Felixes. That because he'd done Velvet Alley, he worked with Art Carney, who was the original Felix Unger on Broadway. And then he worked with Jack Lemmon in Days of Wine and Roses. And then, of course, he worked with Tony Randall.
And he also filled in for Matthau, I believe.
He replaced Matthau.
Yeah.
He replaced Matthau, and then he did the London production of this.
Yeah.
So but I don't believe Carney was, at that point, I don't believe, Carney didn't stay with it too long, so I don't believe he was playing Oscar by the time.
But I think Lemmon was, but I might be wrong.
But I think it was Eddie Bracken who was playing. Was playing his Felix. But anyway, but Velvet Alley is an amazing piece of work. It is about a writer who is struggling, and his agent, who is played by Jack Klugman, refuses to give up on him. And all of a sudden, he gets successful, and he goes Hollywood. And it's an amazing Art Carney performance. It's an amazing Jack Klugman performance. A young Leslie Nielsen is in this cast. It's an amazing piece, and it's a piece that, if I was going to stage as a full play any of Rod's work, I would stage Velvet Alley, because it's second to me only to Requiem for a Heavyweight as his best piece of writing. And nobody knows it. I've talked to people who love Rod Serling of the Twilight Zone and said, "Have you ever seen Velvet Alley?" And they look at you like, "What are you talking about?"
Well, the Velvet Alley, at least references to the Velvet Alley surfaces in Mark's latest book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, which is available in bookstores everywhere through Thomas Dunn books. The Loner was not the first Western that Rod wrote. He wrote, I'm blanking on the titles, but you mentioned them both in the book. There's the one with Dan Duryea and Malcolm Atterbury, which is the basis of several lessons in the book.
That's exactly right. Reinvention, and that one is called Mr. Denton on Doomsday.
Yes.
I believe, is that right? Did I just come up with the right title?
Yes, Mr. Denton. I believe it's Mr. Denton on Doomsday.
Yeah, because sometimes I just reach for something and I reach for the wrong thing.
That's okay.
Yeah, and of course, Showdown with Rance McGrew.
With Larry Blyden.
Yeah, with Larry Blyden,
and
exactly right.
Yeah.
And Mr. Garrity in the Grave.
Yes.
So you couldn't have been alive at that point and not sort of reference the Western or because Westerns were so. I was trying to explain this to my class last night at Kent State. I showed them the Magnificent Seven.
Wow.
And 1960, and I was trying to explain the real Magnificent.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
And I was trying to emphasize to them, just how huge. I mean, it's like if you look at the ratings for 1960, I think like 14 of the top 20 shows were Westerns.
Mm-hmm.
It's like so, the Twilight Zone existed, never as a top 20 show, but in a landscape which was surrounded by Dodge cities and horses and sheriffs and gunplay. I mean, that was the era of Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Rawhide, Wagon Train, Have Gun Will Travel, The Rifleman. These were the big hits on TV at the time. These were the big shows at the time. So the idea that Rod would, and Westerns, I mean, there was America's entertainment at that point. Mm-hmm. There was no close second on TV at that time. And this is another discussion. But the Western snuck in some of this stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't get credit for it. But if you look at like early episodes of Bonanza
or Gunsmoke,
they were sneaking in some messages.
Yeah.
Because it was in the guise of the Old West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They were getting in some social conscious stuff too. Richard Matheson wrote Westerns too. He wrote Western novels. People aren't aware of that. He wrote episodes of Western shows. He wrote war novels. He wrote episodes of war series too. So these guys, they were writers. And they had more of a vision of themselves as writers. We have become increasingly intrigued by the labels. As that who is Stephen King? Well, Stephen King's a horror writer. Robert Louis Stevenson, because he wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Body Snatcher and some other masterpieces, did not consider himself a horror writer. The term didn't exist. He happened to be a writer who wrote a lot of different things, and horror happened to be one of them. And we as American culture has created the labeling system, where you slap a label and say, well, Alfred Hitchcock, he's a thriller director, and we reward them for that. We reward people for being specialists. We don't reward people for being
a jack of all trades.
For being just, it's like, why isn't Robert Wise considered the equal of John Ford? Because Robert Wise is hard for people to pin down, but he happened to be great at a lot of different things: musicals, horror, science fiction, biographies. He was a pretty amazing director, and he gets penalized for being good at a lot of different things.
I can think of several television directors who would fall into the same category. I mean, they worked nonstop,
right?
Because they were able to work successfully in different genres.
Oh, you see names that people don't know. Ed, you're actually Don Weiss. Nobody knows who Don Weiss is.
I do.
Nobody knows. Look him up. Just IMDb the guy. And you're going to go, holy. And look, this thing doesn't stop.
Yeah.
He worked on Night Stalker. He worked on the Andy Griffith Show. He worked everywhere, all the time, on radically different shows.
Yeah.
And you're right. Yeah, these were the craftsmen. These were the people who. So but again, I think that generation, it's why Richard Matheson hated the term horror writer. It's not because he wasn't proud of the horror that he'd written. It's just that it reduced him to a label, and he just considered himself a writer who, okay, well, I've written science fiction, I've written horror, I've written war stories, I've written westerns, I've written comedy. He was a little bewildered that people just wanted to call him a horror writer. And, it's the same way, you want to lose your head, call Harlan Ellison a science fiction writer.
We're talking to Mark Dawidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, a heartfelt tribute to Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone that also doubles as a self-help book. Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone is available in bookstores everywhere through Thomas Dunn Books. You can also find it both in hardback edition and as an ebook through Amazon.com and wherever books are sold online. It's funny that you should mention Harlan Ellison because he's another, and now again, strictly speaking, Harlan did not write for the original Twilight Zone, but he was a consultant on the 1980s Twilight Zone for CBS.
That's right.
Harlan Ellison, he's another iconic writer that you bring to life in Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, Mark, because of you have many anecdotal stories about your friendship with Harlan.
First, one follows the other. If you know Harlan Ellison, then you have anecdotal stories.
Yeah.
That's impossible not to have anecdotal stories, and he's great for anecdotal stories. But it's true that I met Harlan through the Twilight Zone because he was the creative consultant on the 1985 revival for CBS, and CBS asked me at the time, is there anybody you'd like to interview? And I said, Harlan Ellison. And they said, yeah, we can arrange that. And so when we did the interview, the first thing Harlan said was, all right, bucko, one rule. And I said, I can't call you a science fiction writer. He said, God bless you. I believe in God. He said, that's how much I mean it. That's how much I mean it, So we hit it off like right off. And and that began a sort of an ongoing, So, and it's like I say, it's impossible. Harlan knew two very important writers to the Twilight Zone were very important to Harlan, Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont. And Richard and Chuck Beaumont were very close friends, very, very close. They were writers who came up together. They sort of paced each other. One would write a novel, the other would write a novel. The one would sell something to TV, the other would sell something to TV. They were the families, the children, everybody was very close. So, Harlan has sort of a connection to the Twilight Zone, which is not so much the show, the original show, and it's not so much because he wrote for The Outer Limits, of course. Mm-hmm. He wrote for, the other anthology show, or one of the other anthology shows. But he does have sort of a very tight spiritual connection because, two of the guys who had an enormous impact on the shaping of the Twilight Zone were writers who were very close friends of his and also, almost mentors to him. So, I don't think that Harlan would say any different about Richard and Charles Beaumont.
And he wrote a very famous Star Trek episode.
Well,
sort
he
of.
One.
Yeah.
Yes.
The most famous one.
We're talking to Mark Dawidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. We will carry over our conversation with Mark into our second hour. Then we will welcome back longtime television director Ralph Senesky. Ralph began his career as a television director with a directing assignment on the Twilight Zone. We'll talk about that and more during hour number 2 of TV Confidential. Stay with us.
Hi, this is Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passionate World Radio Network. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. I want to tell you that since I started attending the courses put out by T.R. Garland for leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals, that PWR Network has accomplished several of its goals. 1, JV partnership. 2, JV advocates. 3, a potential writing position. 4, an invitation to collaborate with a major internet radio network. 5, 400% increase on the profiles that have connected with me and who have come to review PWRN's profile. 2 potential clients, both CEOs. And I finally recognized and found my ideal audience. I cannot thank T.R. Garland enough for his course, 12 weeks of leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals. And you too can achieve this kind of stellar accomplishment. So don't hesitate. Contact T.R. Garland today. Connect with him on LinkedIn and ask him about his course, Leveraging LinkedIn for Speakers, Authors, Coaches, and Service-Based Professionals. You won't regret it. In fact, you'll probably thank him.
Hi, this is Loretta Swit, and you're listening to TV Confidential.
There is a 5th dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Ed Robertson with a reminder that longtime television director Ralph Senesky will join us later on in this hour. We hope you'll stay tuned for that. In the meantime, Tony Figueroa and Donna Allen are with us, along with our guest Mark Dawidziak, television critic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the author of several books on film and television, including The Columbo File, The Night Stalker Companion, and Jim Tully, American Writer, Irish Rover, and Hollywood Brawler. Mark's latest book is Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, a new book that takes all of the various life lessons, ground rules, inspirational thoughts, and musings of the Twilight Zone, and basically says we would all be much better people if we lived our life according to what the Twilight Zone teaches us. Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone is available in bookstores everywhere through Thomas Dunn Books. You can also find it both as a hardcover edition and as an ebook through Amazon.com and wherever books are sold online. Before we went to break, Mark was talking about his longtime friendship with Harlan Ellison, creative consultant for the 1985 revival of The Twilight Zone that aired on CBS. Harlan Ellison is among the many, many alumni of The Twilight Zone who contributed guest lessons to Everything I Need to Know I Learned in The Twilight Zone. As we pick up the conversation.
You know, it's interesting that when Harlan became the creative consultant on The Twilight Zone in '85, I said to him, you know, why are you doing this? You have always said you would never work for television again. That was '85. I said, you always said you would never work for television again. And he said, his rationale, he said, I'm not. I'm working for The Twilight Zone. He said, what writer would risk going to his grave saying that they hadn't written for The Twilight Zone? He said, so this is my opportunity. You know, and he had that, you know, that answer for that. But sure enough, he also said in that same interview that he said, I'm hardcore unemployable. You know, he somewhat predicted that the relationship would blow up. You know, he somewhat predicted that this wasn't going to last. You know, he was going to enjoy it for as long as it lasted, but he didn't expect it to last forever. And it didn't. It didn't. So, but yeah, that's one of the, you know, there are so many lines that have crossed in my life that cross with the Twilight Zone. You know, and that's one of them. So, you know, there are these constants. You know, there's another guy who didn't write for the Twilight Zone, and probably should have, and that's Robert Bloch. You know, how did Robert Bloch not write for the Twilight? He was writing for Thriller. He was writing for another anthology show that was on, but, you know, and he was writing for Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Mm-hmm. But, you know, Bloch was another one who could have written for the Twilight Zone but didn't.
Final question for now. There's 51 life lessons that you share with readers and Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. If you had to pick one that is indispensable, which one would that be, Mark?
Oh, I'll go right to The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. It's Divided We Fall. I think it is the most compelling and resonant lesson right now. I think it is. I didn't realize that when I was writing the book. I mean, I certainly understood the importance of the lesson. I think that has only grown, since the book has been published, as I realized that episode is, I wouldn't say it's my favorite of the chapters or anything like that. I think I have several favorite chapters. I love the chapter on To Serve Man. It was the first one I wrote.
Yeah.
It's in the middle of the book, but it was the first one I wrote. And so, and I think that one is, there's so many wonderful interpretations, delicious interpretations, if you will, of To Serve Man. I had a lot of fun with that chapter, but I think it's also relevant. I think it's true. I like the chapter on Nightmare at 20,000 feet, because I like the idea. Somebody asked, they said, what lesson are you going to derive from that? Don't get in a plane with a gremlin on the wing. And I said, well, no. My lesson from that is when nobody else believes in you, believe in yourself. Is that the central character played by William Shatner is, he everybody around him thinks he's crazy. He's going crazy. He's cracking up. He even starts to think he might be cracking up. But by believing in himself and putting that to the ultimate test, he saves the plane and saves himself by doing this. And by the way, something I'd like to leave everybody with. These are my lessons. This does not mean that I have so much hubris that I think that these are the only interpretations of these episodes. I think that these are, like any piece of great literature, they're open to all kinds of interpretation. And many people will see different lessons in these episodes. And I don't think these episodes would stand up as great literature if that weren't true. These are the lessons I derive from these. And like I said, somebody might watch Nightmare at 20,000 feet and see an entirely different lesson in it. It doesn't make that lesson any more or less valid than, what I had to say. So, I have several, lessons which I think I like the way they came out. And I was always very conscious of going with the Twilight Zone moment. The chapter on the dogs is a very good example of that. There are 2 episodes in which dogs are heroes, and I fully intend. I had a way I was going to write that episode. I sat down to write that episode on a very sunny Sunday afternoon, and I just sat down to write. And I write at a very crowded office at the very top of our house, which we call the Bell Tower. And I have a oil painting that a friend of mine had done of Rod Serling that hangs over my desk, a little bit to the left over my desk. And I sat down to write this episode, and there's a knock on the door downstairs. So I go down, my neighbor is standing there, and he's got this dog. And he says, do you know whose dog this is? I said, no. He said, well, he just showed up in our backyard. And, he said, well, I can keep him in our backyard. And I said, well, yeah, that's good. That'd be good. So I went back up to my desk, and I'm starting to write. And all I can see is that dog's face in front of me. And then I look up, and I see Rod Serling's face looking at me, as if saying, how in the world could you leave that poor dog? And the more I try to dismiss it, the more I see these 2 faces staring at me. So I finally just said, I give up. And I went down and I got our spare leash for, our dog Dombey. Has 2. So I got one of the spare leash. I went to next door. I said, give me the dog. Because the best way to find the owner of a lost dog is to walk your neighborhood. Sooner or later, you're going to see a car going up very slowly one street and down the other, looking for the lost pooch. So we went like 2 blocks, and I see a car, and I wave at the car, and the car pulls over, and there's these 2 desperate, worried people inside. And they open the door, and the dog jumps in, and it's like, it's a Hallmark moment. These people have been reunited with their best friend. And and they're so grateful. And so, I take the leash off, I go back, and I sit down to write the chapter. And I think, if this does not become the lead of this chapter, you are spitting in the face of a gift from the universe.
Exactly.
The universe just gave you how to start this chapter. You're going to tell this exactly as it just happened. And that's what I did. It became the lead of that chapter. So I was always very conscious of, like I said, going with those moments. If those moments happened to come into this, I said, all right, I'm going to go with this. And somebody asked me a couple weeks ago if this was a tough book to write, and I said no. This was, books are not easy.
Nope.
Books are marathons.
Yep.
And you have to train for them like you would a marathon, and you have to have the discipline. But this book was a fairly easy book to write, for me at least, because I treated it like 50 conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to make the book as conversational as possible, so I always look forward to getting to the next chapter, because it felt like I was engaging in a new conversation. And you all have already figured out how shy and reticent I am about talking. So this was, this was not to me, it was not a difficult book. The only thing that was difficult about this book was always having in mind wanting to do right by Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone.
Well, I would like to think, Mark, that wherever he is in the great ether, he is very happy with how the book came out.
Well, I'd like to think so. Anne has said that her dad would have loved the book, and that's about as high praise as you can get. You can pretty much say it doesn't matter what other reviews you get after that. You just sort of say, okay, I'll take that.
Mark Dawidziak is the author of Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in The Twilight Zone, a heartfelt tribute to Rod Serling and The Twilight Zone that also doubles as a self-help book and which features a heartfelt foreword by Rod's daughter, Anne Serling. Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in The Twilight Zone, available wherever books are sold through Thomas Dunn Books. You can also find it at Amazon.com, wherever books are sold online. Mark Dawidziak, thank you as always for your time and for sharing this book with us. We look forward to our next conversation.
Oh, no, thank you for doing it, Ed.
Ralph Senesky will join us when we come back on TV Confidential.
Hi, this is Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passionate World Radio Network. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. I want to tell you that since I started attending the courses put out by T.R. Garland for leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals, that PWR Network has accomplished several of its goals. 1, JV partnership. 2, JV advocates. 3, a potential writing position. 4, an invitation to collaborate with a major internet radio network. 5, 400% increase on the profiles that have connected with me and who have come to review PWRN's profile. 2 potential clients, both CEOs. And I finally recognized and found my ideal audience. I cannot thank T.R. Garland enough for his course, 12 weeks of leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals. And you, too, can achieve this kind of stellar accomplishment. So don't hesitate. Contact T.R. Garland today. Connect with him on LinkedIn and ask him about his course, Leveraging LinkedIn for Speakers, Authors, Coaches, and Service-Based Professionals. You won't regret it. In fact, you'll probably thank him.
Hi, this is Michael Learned, and you're listening to TV Confidential.
Ed Robertson welcoming you back to TV Confidential, radio talk show about television that is always happy to welcome back our friend Ralph Senesky. Ralph is one of the most prolific directors in TV history, particularly when it comes to episodic television. If you watch any of the various retro digital networks that are on TV today, you will likely see, directed by Ralph Senesky, attached to such shows as Route 66, Naked City, The Fugitive, The Wild Wild West, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, The Partridge Family, The FBI, The Waltons, The Paper Chase, Dynasty, The Twilight Zone, and the original Star Trek. Ralph Senesky is also an active blogger who has shared many great stories about his experiences in network television. He also has a great story about a recent find, speaking of the Waltons, that is directly related to one of the episodes that Ralph directed on the Waltons many years ago. We'll talk about that and more in just a sec. But first, Ralph Senesky, welcome back to the program.
Hello to you.
There are any number of things we can start a conversation with. Let's go with something you just mentioned before we started recording. We mentioned the episode The Pony Cart, which is one of the many episodes of The Waltons that you directed when that show was originally in production in the 70s. And The Pony Cart, we mentioned this when we talked about last time. Beulah Bondi, the great actress that you directed in that episode, she was nominated for an Emmy Award in that episode. There was a recent discovery related to the Waltons that was commemorated at the recent Waltons gathering in Schuyler, Virginia in late March. And that was commemorated as part of a film that you appeared in. I know you appeared in the film. Did you direct the film?
Oh, no, I did it.
Okay, all right.
All of it. I had one of my friends up here. I'm not too sure. I think he was even using just an iPhone to record it. But no, I did half of it, and they had done half of it with David Harper, Jim Bob, telling about his friends who had been the prop house that had produced the Pony Cart those many years ago. No, so I did half of it. It was I did my half, they did their half, and I didn't know they were doing that. And it was all put together, and I just am very pleased with it.
Yeah, and the 21-minute film about the discovery of the original Pony Cart from the Pony Cart episode of the Waltons, that appears on Ralph's website, which is Senesky.com. You can also find it at...
Oh, it would just be at Senesky.com.
Okay,
It's Ralph's Cinema Trek.
Okay, Ralph's Cinema Trek at Senensky.com. And it's pretty amazing because just to show how far things have gone since the medium began, I mean, you can use something as portable as an iPhone to record and film and capture something, and then with the various software and tools that are at your disposal and in post-production, you could put together. It's a long way from the old Super 8 home movies.
Sure is.
And it's clean and it's clear and it's sharp, and obviously you can show it on a theater screen.
I think so. Yes. And I must correct you about one thing, Ed.
Sure.
Beulah was not only nominated, she won the Emmy for her performance in The Pony Cart. And as I tell in my little bit when I'm on camera, that was the last film she ever made. She was 87 years old at the time. It's the last film she made, and she won the Emmy that year. And she was really a sensational lady.
And you can find, I would imagine, that the backstory of the film is included on the page that you include about the Pony Cart, which appears at Ralph's Cinema Trek at Senensky.com.
Along with the post that about this, I have a post on every one of the Waltons that I did, and there's a whole post on the Pony Cart, including clips that are the total film, where I talk about, can tell about the making of it and where we made it. Well, all of the details that I could remember, almost like, but I like to think of my posts as being fly on the wall.
Well, not only fly on the wall, Ralph. I mean, your memory is uncanny. You correct me if I'm wrong, when you write about whether it's the Pony Cart or any of the episodes of the Waltons that you directed or any of the episodes of the many other TV series that you list on Ralph's Cinema Trek, you are, for the most part, you're working off the shooting script, the final shooting script that you worked with, and whatever notes you made, and you just look at the script, and then you know what, that will trigger one thing or another or another. Is that true, or did you take a diary when you?
I think that's totally true. Yep. I mean, at this stage in my next life, I will keep a daily diary. In my later years, I will have those notes, but this time I didn't. So I was totally at the mercy of the script, the film, and the schedule. In some cases, a few extraneous things, but not that many. I mean, most of the time it was just the script and the film and my memory.
Well, obviously you're blessed with a great memory. Have you always, this is going to sound like a stupid question, but it relates to the capturing. I mean, because basically your Ralph Cinema Trek is a living, breathing work of history. It's told from, it's a memoir but it's also living, breathing history is told from your point of view. Were you always gifted with such a good memory, or is that just part of your background? You know, coming.
I think I was, but it wasn't being used this way. I had it during the years that I was directing, both for stage and film. But this was my first excursion into writing, which was to sort of pull all those random thoughts together. So the website is that, but I guess the memory was there before. I mean, but it wasn't used in this way before.
Well, whatever.
And don't forget, when I was 30 years old, I didn't have that much to remember.
Well, we're very thankful that you from age 30 to right. Well, you're 39 right now, so it's so.
But turn that around since it's coming up, I like to think of my coming birthday as being 100 minus 6.
Okay, well, you are 94 as we have this conversation, so that obviously that in the 64 years since then, obviously you retained. Whether you realized it or not, you retained a lot. And we are not only as, for people like me who are television historians, but also just fans of the many shows that you worked on. And what's particularly interesting is, besides stories about actors, say, like a Gene Hackman, who you directed in television before he became a movie star, but there are a lot of small roles that you cast. And again, it goes back to, we've said this before. In fact, I know we've said this to you in our conversation with you, Ralph. Working in film and television, it's no different than working in any other line of industry. It's about relationships. And when you're a director, when you have a chance to cast the whole entire picture, or to the extent you can, if it's a small role, but a significant role that requires a certain actor who could deliver it in a certain way, you may think of, there's a David Morrow who I worked with once upon a time. I think he'd be good in that, and so you suggest him, and lo and behold, he's available.
And sometimes even somebody that I didn't know but had seen on the stage. And one of the cases where that happened was when I cast William Wyndham in the episode of the FBI, The Assassin. And that was a whole... I don't know if we talked about that on our last discussion or not.
We did not, but I'm very glad you did, because I am going through the FBI as we speak. And I love that show. I love that particular episode, not only because I like William Wyndham anyway. He's good. You could ask him to, this is a cliche, but it's true. You can ask him to perform a page out of the phone directory, and he would make it sound interesting, because he could do a lot of things. But that particular episode where he plays an assassin, it's a good example of what made the FBI a unique show in the QM catalog, because it's an anthology show. It had regular characters, Ephraim Zimbalist and Stephen Brooks at the time, but it was really a showcase for guest actors, and because it was an anthology show with running characters, and that was a great character that Wyndham played.
And the thing about Wyndham was that I had to fight for him, and I didn't know him. I just seen him on the stage at one of the stages out at UCLA, and the character was an assassin.
Mm-hmm.
And I started off, and my original image was David Wayne. I wanted somebody blonde.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted somebody fair, somebody who did not look like a television villain.
Mm-hmm.
And David was not available, and there were a couple of other names thrown at me. They suggested George C. Scott. Well, George was against the thing I had in mind, but I had worked with George, and I just wouldn't say no to a chance to work with him again, but he wasn't available. And they suggested Gig Young, and again, he was not the image, but at least he was, at that point, he was basically a comedian. This was before They Shoot Horses.
Yeah.
He was basically a comedian, and so again, I wouldn't say no, but he wasn't available. And there was one other actor that the casting was really pushing, and I won't name him. And fine actor, but he was exactly what I didn't want.
Yeah.
And I just hung on, and I finally got him. And the day after the show aired, John Conwell, who was Quinn's assistant
mm-hmm.
and really oversaw all of the casting, and John, who was a close friend,
mm-hmm.
and he told me that he had call after call after call commending him on the casting of William Wyndham.
Now, John, you knew as far back from The Twilight Zone, correct?
Yes, he had cast The Twilight Zone, and I knew him before when he was an actor.
Yeah.
I mean, we were close personal friends, so
mm-hmm.
that I knew him all the way back to the days, back in the 50s, the days of Playhouse 90, when Ethel Wynand, the casting director, well, on Playhouse 90, they would start on a Monday and work in a rehearsal hall for 2 weeks, and then the third week they would move on to the stage, and on Thursday they would do the show. Well, they wouldn't hire the whole cast to start on that first day in the rehearsal hall. It would have been too expensive, so they would cast the major roles, and then 4 or 5 days later, they would add the next contingent. And what they would do then, Ethel would have stand-ins, young actors.
Mm-hmm.
John was one of them. There were several. And they would be playing these roles, and then when they got cast, they would move into other roles, and then in the end, they would end up with small roles on the show itself. So I'd known John back to those days, and that was in 1956, 1957.
I talked to John many, many, many years ago. He was another guy with a great memory and excellent sense of recall. And I mean, I'm just thinking aloud here. So if I'm off base, just tell me. But it seems to me, because you both came from the theater, and with theater, when you're performing on stage, you have to absorb a lot of details, because you don't. Sometimes you are working within the limitation of the set and the stage. And so it seems to me, coming from that experience and being able to draw on a lot of details in order to portray it dramatically on the stage, that's something that may have come in. I'm guessing that's a trait that came to mind when you sat down and started writing about your experiences.
Oh, absolutely. And then, and when you use the word limitations, I must tell you, one of the important mantras that I have, I got at the Pasadena Playhouse, but in the decade before that, this is back, now we're talking about the late 40s,
mm-hmm.
and Frayne Williams, who was a white-haired, older Englishman who taught a class, I think it was 1 hour a week on Shakespeare. Well, you're not going to learn too much in a 1 hour classroom on Shakespeare, but I learned one of the most important things ever from something he said, and that was that great art is the sublimation of limitations. That to me is, I think someplace on my website I've quoted that, but I also paraphrase it and say television was the sublimation of limitations.
I'm writing that down. That's a great line.
It's an absolutely great line, because you touched on it, and I learned that on the stage, and it becomes even more important because in film you just have so much more latitude for detail and to do more than just do a close-up of somebody saying words.
Yeah.
It is called moving pictures, and it's pictures, it's pictorial, and you just look for what you can film and what you can show rather than hear.
We're talking to Ralph Senesky, longtime member of the Directors Guild of America and a man whose work as a television director stretches from The Twilight Zone to multiple episodes of some of the most popular drama and comedy series of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Ralph shares many stories about his experiences in network television on his excellent blog page, which you can find at Ralph's Cinematrek at Senesky.com. Let's see. This kind of stems from the story you told about how you really had to lobby to get William Wyndham to play that assassin in that second season episode of the FBI. Now, at the time, if I remember correctly, this is like 66, 67. At the time, you were actually this was unusual for you, Ralph, because you were under contract. You were one of the regular directors of the FBI during that season, as opposed to going from show to show as you often did and as many directors did on television. But during that particular stretch, you were one of like 2 or 3 regular directors of the FBI. Now, it seems to me there are both pros and cons to being a regular director on a television series. Does that reflect your experience, or does it?
Very much so. That was the only year I did that. Otherwise, I freelanced, and I would work on 2 or 3 or 4 different series and alternate. But that was very early in my career. That was as you said, the 1966-67 season, and I had done. The year before, I had worked for Quinn Martin for the first time on The Fugitive and 12 O'Clock High. Mm-hmm. And then the following season, I did The Fugitive, and I did 3 FBIs, and then Quinn, they signed me to do half of the FBIs, 15 of them.
Yeah.
I only lasted through 8. It was too heavy a spell for me, which got complicated because one of my main reasons for wanting to do this series was the wonderful cameraman, William Spencer. Mm-hmm. We had done 12 O'Clock High and the FBI at that point. And after the first 4 shows, he was taken off to photograph Quinn's first and only feature film, The Mephisto Waltz. Mm-hmm. And I ended up then, the next 4 shows, I had 3 different cameramen. And there wasn't that easy rapport. Directing the show just became harder. And the last one I had, the third of the 3 cameramen, we did not get along. And I asked if I could just have some time off, just to sit out a show. And there became some contractual problems with that, so I ended up just leaving the show and never did that again.
Well, you never made a deal where you were a regular director on a show again, but you did return to the FBI a couple of years later. I mean,
it was many years later.
Many years later, yeah. But again, Ralph goes into the ins and outs and the backstory of the episodes he's directed for the FBI and all the other shows that he directed on his website, Ralph's Cinematrek, which you can find at Senesky.com. Kind of dovetailing on that question, just in general, because you mentioned William Spencer as a DP that you enjoyed working with. And if I remember correctly, you use the term painter of light when you talk about Spencer's work, which is also a term that you used when you described your experience of working with Gerald Finnerman, the cinematographer on Star Trek, when you worked on Star Trek in the 60s. How important in general, how important is it for a director to be in sync with a cinematographer?
Well, it's very important, and it's even more difficult in television. I mean, if you're doing a feature, You're in it from the beginning. You're in it from the conception. You pick the cameraman, and it's that. Directing in television, you walked onto a set. You know, the first time I walked onto a set, that was when I met Billy Spencer, the first time when I did the second of my 12 o'clock highs. And that was true of all of them. And it's a matter of you're getting in sync, and some of them, well, I didn't have too much trouble with getting in sync too many times. Most of the time I got in sync, but some of the cameramen I got into better sync with. Billy was one of them. Jerry Finnerman was one of them. Joe Byrock, Russell Meddy. Television was different. I mean, it was cramming what today would be a 2-year experience. in those days, it wasn't that long, into 13 days. And that's the prep and the shooting.
Yeah. Today, I think for a 60-minute show, I think today they allow as many as 10 days. Mm-hmm. But back when you were directing television, I think at most you had 6 days to do it.
Quinn had 7.
Yeah.
But the others had 6. Let me go back and say that on the FBI, the fact that I left after those 8 shows really turned out to be a blessing, mm-hmm. because I was then available a couple of months later. I don't think it was even 2 months later, when an offer came that I could accept, and that was my first Star Trek.
That's right. That's right. And you directed many of the classic episodes of...
Not that many. Not that many. Actually, I was involved in 7.
Well,
look, six and a half of the 7, and that's a whole other story that you can get the answer to on my website.
Which is Ralph Cinematrek at Senesky.com. I will just say, Ralph, 6.5 shows from 3 years, in my opinion, that's a significant contribution.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were only 79 episodes altogether.
Yes. But absolutely.
When you consider that Mark Daniels and Joe Pevney, who were there early in the first season, I came in near the end of the first season, and the 3 of us directed almost half of the Star Treks.
We're talking to Ralph Senesky, longtime member of the Directors Guild of America. We'll continue our conversation with Ralph after this quick time out here on TV Confidential.
Hi, this is Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passionate World Radio Network. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. I want to tell you that since I started attending the courses put out by T.R. Garland for leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals, that PWR Network has accomplished several of its goals. 1, JV partnership. 2, JV advocates. 3, a potential writing position. 4, an invitation to collaborate with a major internet radio network. 5, 400% increase on the profiles that have connected with me and who have come to review PWRN's profile. 2 potential clients, both CEOs. And I finally recognized and found my ideal audience. I cannot thank T.R. Garland enough for his course, 12 weeks of leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals. And you, too, can achieve this kind of stellar accomplishment. So don't hesitate. Contact T.R. Garland today. Connect with him on LinkedIn and ask him about his course, Leveraging LinkedIn for Speakers, Authors, Coaches, and Service-Based Professionals. You won't regret it. In fact, you'll probably thank him.
Hi, this is David Frankham, and you're listening to TV Confidential.
Ed Robertson with a reminder that the next edition of TV Confidential will air next week on the station at the usual time. We hope you'll join us for that. In the meantime, our guest this hour is Ralph Senesky. After graduating from the Pasadena Playhouse School of Theater, Ralph began his career directing regional theater and summer stock productions before moving into network television, first as a production supervisor on Playhouse 90, and then as an assistant producer and later director of episodes of Dr. Kildare. Dr. Kildare led Ralph to a directing assignment on The Twilight Zone, which in turn paved the way for a long career as a television director that included work on such popular series as The Paper Chase, Dynasty, Heart to Heart, The Waltons, 8 is Enough, The Rookies, Barnaby Jones, The FBI, The Fugitive, The Partridge Family, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, Route 66, Naked City, and the original Star Trek. Ralph Senesky is also an active blogger who has shared many great stories about his experiences in network television. You can read about them at Ralph's Cinema Trek at Senesky.com. We'll ask a couple more questions about Quinn Martin, then we'll move on to other topics. But we've been talking about the FBI. One of my favorite things that I learned from reading Ralph's Cinema Trek at Senesky.com, you called Ephraim Zimbalist Zimmy. I love that. Zimmy.
Everybody did.
Well, I did not know that it was his nickname. The great thing about watching Zimbalist, and I had a chance to talk to Ephraim a couple of times, and I read his book. So I know he was a very cultured, very eloquent, very funny man, and very warm man in real life. And even though by design we did not get to see a lot of the person behind Inspector Erskine, because Ephraim was such a gifted actor, he would find little nuances whenever possible, and that made the show watchable week to week to week, even if the stories got to be somewhat interchangeable.
Oh, absolutely. And not only that, he was a very, very accomplished, underrated actor.
Mm-hmm.
You got to see more of his talent as an actor, but not that many times. He went into television between 77 Sunset Strip and this. I mean, that was a lot of years. But I mean, his performance in Wait Until Dark,
yes,
with Hepburn, is just a lovely performance. I mean, he was another version of Cary Grant. It was that kind of charm, but acting ability. And you totally believed him, but he was just so charming.
Speaking of Wait Until Dark, the South Pasadena Library, which is not far from where we record this program, Ralph, they screened Wait Until Dark a few weeks ago on a theater. So I had watched that movie on television many years ago. I had never seen it in a theater with a live audience before. And that famous scene, we won't give too much of it away, but there's a famous scene that takes place that is filmed completely with the screen to black, is the best way to describe it. And there's a moment when Alan Arkin emerges, and I jumped out of my seat.
Oh, it's a true thriller.
Very, very, very much so. Very much so. Now, and this relates to Star Trek and the FBI. An actor that you worked with quite a bit, but mostly on the FBI, but again on one of the last episodes of Star Trek that you did was Stephen Brooks. Now, you worked with him a lot, and while you did not know him that well beyond the set, you worked with him enough to sense that there was a little bit, I mean, that all was not well behind the scenes with him. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, not so much Stephen. I mean, that was truly, really true of all of the actors I worked with, because of working in television and the pace of television. Not the pace, but just the fact that you had so little time to get things done, and there just wasn't a lot of time to be leisurely and social. And I've said on my website that, and I'm not even sure I realized this until I did the website and started going back and looking and reviewing and remembering and realizing that in most cases, I didn't really know the actor. I knew the character they were portraying, because
Yeah.
that during my association with them, that was who I was associating with.
No, that makes sense, and I've talked to other actors and other producers where along the same lines, where even if they're working with, say, James Garner on the set, when they're working with him during the 6 or 7 days they're shooting, they will not. When they refer to him as Jim, they're not referring to him as Jim Garner. They're referring to him as Jim Rockford or whatever he's playing if his character's name is Jim, because and I understand both from the director and the actor's point of view. When you refer to him as the character, even in between takes, it helps him stay in character and do what he needs to do or she needs to do in the next scene that you are guiding him with as when the cameras start rolling again.
Even if I, like in case of the FBI, I didn't refer to Zimbalist as Ephraim or rather as Erskine.
Yeah.
But so I called him Zimmy. We were friendly, and there was a friendly, but it was a friendship that was, limited because of the time and the conditions under which it was happening.
We're talking to Ralph Senesky, longtime member of the Directors Guild of America and a man whose work as a television director stretches from The Twilight Zone to multiple episodes of some of the most popular drama and comedy series of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Ralph shares many stories about his experiences in network television on his excellent blog page, which you can find at Senesky.com. Ralph's Cinema Trek at Senesky.com. Ralph, earlier in our conversation, we were talking about some of the changes that technology has made to directing today and to filmmaking in general. In terms of style today, there seems to be a trend in edgy for the sake of edgy and dark for the sake of dark. And that's all well and good if you want to establish a sense of style, but it goes back to a director, a filmmaker, you're a storyteller. And
that's right.
Whatever choices you make as a filmmaker, they have to serve the story,
Absolutely.
But
in storytelling, it's based on detail, and there's craft. There is craft. I mean, not anybody can go into a dentist office and do dental work.
No.
They prepare for it, but they think that anybody can be a director, and that's not true.
Well, certainly in this day and age of YouTube and Vimeo, it's very easy for someone to put their work out. But at the same time, there are a lot of legitimate people who are trying to make good films and take advantage of the medium. So it's a matter of the ones who, whether they're going to film school or learning, as you did, learning by doing and telling good stories and using the camera to move the story along. There are a lot of those out there that need to be discovered. So
there are great talents, always, but how many of them there are, and how many that aren't talented that are in for the ride?
Yeah.
Can I tell you a great story that was told to me?
Go ahead.
30 years ago. It was on the set of The Heart to Heart, and Johnny Gifford told me the story. Mother Teresa dies and goes to heaven. When she goes before God, not necessarily God, but all the dignitaries of heaven are there to greet her, and then they announce to her, Mother Teresa, you have spent your life doing so much good. We want to honor that, and we've tried to figure out how we can do that, and we've decided that the way we'll do that is that we will give you anything that you want, anything, your one most wanted desire, we will fulfill it. That's in response to your great life. What would that be? And she said, I would wish that there would never again be war. And they all looked at each other and said, isn't that just like Mother Teresa? Again, thinking of others. No, Mother Teresa, this is personal. This is something for you. She thought, and she said, I would wish that there would be no more illness in the world. And again, they looked at each other and they chuckled and they said, isn't that just like Mother Teresa? No, Mother Teresa, this time we're not going to let you off the hook. You are going to have to pick something, your most heartfelt desire. And she thought, and she said, I would like to direct. Isn't that a good? And I'll tell you something. 30 years ago, it was a laugher.
Yeah.
Today, it's not, because today it's come true.
It's true. That's true. Well, that's a topic. That's definitely a topic for another conversation. We're talking to Ralph Senesky, longtime member of the Directors Guild of America, and a man whose work as a television director stretches from The Twilight Zone to multiple episodes of some of the most popular drama and comedy series of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We will talk some more about Ralph's career as a director for television and for the stage when we play part 2 of our conversation with Ralph Senesky later this month on TV Confidential. In the meantime, for more information on Ralph, go to Ralph's Cinema Trek at Senesky.com. Stay with us, folks. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passionate World Radio Network. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. I want to tell you that since I started attending the courses put out by T.R. Garland for leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals, that PWR Network has accomplished several of its goals. 1, JV partnership. 2, JV advocates. 3, a potential writing position. 4, an invitation to collaborate with a major internet radio network. 5, 400% increase on the profiles that have connected with me and who have come to review PWRN's profile. 2 potential clients, both CEOs. And I finally recognized and found my ideal audience. I cannot thank T.R. Garland enough for his course, 12 weeks of leveraging LinkedIn for speakers, authors, coaches, and service-based professionals. And you, too, can achieve this kind of stellar accomplishment. So don't hesitate. Contact T.R. Garland today. Connect with him on LinkedIn and ask him about his course, Leveraging LinkedIn for Speakers, Authors, Coaches, and Service-Based Professionals. You won't regret it. In fact, you'll probably thank him.
Hi, this is Ed Robertson, and you're listening to TV Confidential.
Ed Robertson with enough time to tell you that if you're a fan of Robert Wagner and Stephanie Powers, our friends at Shout Factory will be releasing all 5 seasons of Heart to Heart as a complete series box set beginning Tuesday, May 30th. Heart to Heart, of course, was more or less a variation of The Thin Man, tailored for Robert Wagner and Stephanie Powers, but with a little more playfulness. Created by Sidney Sheldon, the man behind The Patty Duke Show, I Dream a Genie, and such best-selling novels as Master of the Game, Heart to Heart was a smart and sexy detective drama featuring sparkling and witty dialogue, gorgeous costumes, and a mix of intrigue and adventure, all set in the world of the jet set. Heart to Heart was also one of the most successful dramas produced by Aaron Spelling. Besides featuring all 110 episodes of the original series, Heart to Heart, the complete series box set, includes such bonus features as the original pilot episode featuring audio commentary by Robert Wagner, Stephanie Powers, and director Tom Mankiewicz, plus a 20-minute original featurette called The Heart of Season 1. Heart to Heart, the complete series, comes to DVD for the very first time beginning Tuesday, May 30th from our friends at Shout Factory. And speaking of sharp and stylized, available May 16th on DVD from our friends at Entertainment One is Ice Season 1. Ice is the gritty high-impact crime series from AT&T starring Jeremy Sisto and Donald Sutherland about the dark underbelly of the diamond trade. After the accidental death of a diamond smuggler, a prestigious diamond-dealing family suddenly finds itself under the thumb of a powerful crime boss who draws them into the dangerous world of blood diamonds despite their efforts to keep their business legitimate. Ice Season 1 features all 10 episodes on 3 discs, as well as such bonus content as cast interviews, the music video, Diamond Girl, and more. Retail price for Ice Season 1 is $40.99. Ice Season 1 is available wherever DVDs are sold beginning Tuesday, May 16th from our friends at Entertainment One. If you're a fan of the defending Major League Baseball champion, Chicago Cubs, you could relive all 10 innings of the dramatic Game 7 of the 2016 World Series as part of a brand new 2-disc Blu-ray and DVD release that will become available Tuesday, May 9th from our friends at Shout Factory and Major League Baseball. Whether you're a Cubs fan or simply a baseball fan, Game 7 of the 2016 World Series was one of the most epic World Series games in baseball history. 4 hours and 28 minutes of stomach-turning drama that ended a 108-year championship drought and changed baseball history. The 2016 World Series, the complete Game 7 Ultimate Edition, is a 2-disc collection that includes Game 7 in its entirety, including 4 audio options: original English language Fox TV network broadcasts, the Chicago Cubs radio broadcast, the Cleveland Indians radio broadcast, and Spanish language broadcast. Extra features include extensive highlights of the club's National League Division Series win over the San Francisco Giants, their National League Championship Series win over the Los Angeles Dodgers, expanded World Series parade coverage, and a whole lot more. That's the 2016 World Series, the complete Game 7 Ultimate Edition. The 2016 World Series, the complete game Ultimate Edition, available Tuesday, May 9th, both on Blu-ray and DVD, wherever DVDs and Blu-rays are sold from our friends at Shout Factory and Major League Baseball. A reminder that everything I need to know, I learned in The Twilight Zone is available in bookstores everywhere through Thomas Dunn Books. You can also find it both in hardcover and as an ebook through Amazon.com and wherever books are sold online. For more information on Ralph Senesky, go to Ralph's Cinema Trek at Senensky.com, Senensky, Ralph's Cinema Trek at Senensky.com. That'll do it for our program tonight, folks. Ed Robertson, by help of Tony Figueroa, Donna Allen, Phil Grice, and Greg Airbar, thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you next time on TV Confidential.
Thank you for listening to Passionate World Radio Network, a multimedia company. You can listen to this program all over again at PassionateWorldRadioNetwork.com, Facebook.com/PWRN, Twitter.com/PWRN, GooglePlus.com/PWRN. Distinguish yourself from the ordinary. And remember, please keep listening.